At dawn on June 6, 1944, the Pacific was calm. Too calm. Inside the claustrophobic conning tower of the USS Harder, Commander Samuel Dealey peered through the periscope, his eyes fixed on the silhouettes of 3 Japanese destroyers slicing through the moonlit waters near Tawi Tawi. They were hunting him, and they knew he was close. Dealey, 37 years old, was no stranger to the odds. He'd survived 5 war patrols and sunk 18 enemy ships, but this time the hunters had become obsessed. The Imperial Japanese Navy had sent 3 destroyers, Minazuki, Hayanami, and Tanikaze, with a single order: destroy the submarine that had been dismantling their convoys piece by piece. Until only months before, no American submarine had ever defeated a Japanese destroyer in a head-on fight. The math was brutal. Destroyers raced at 35 knots, while submerged subs crawled at barely 9. Between 1941 and early 1944, 14 U.S. submarines had fallen to Japanese depth charges, and not a single destroyer had gone down in a fair engagement. That changed on April 13th. When the destroyer Ikazuchi charged Harder at full speed, every sailor on Dealey's bridge expected him to dive. Instead, he ordered flank speed, straight at the enemy. At 900 yards, 4 torpedoes fired in a fan. 2 struck home. In 5 minutes, Ikazuchi was gone. Dealey's radio report was brief. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 destroyer. Word of the kill raced across the Pacific submarine fleet and reached Admiral Soimu Toyota, commander of Japan's combined fleet. To him, there was nothing amusing about the loss. By May, 23 Japanese destroyers had already been sunk, and Toyota's grand operation to crush the coming American invasion of the Philippines was unraveling. He gathered his armada at Tawi Tawi, 4 battleships including Yamato, 9 carriers, 15 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, the largest Japanese naval force assembled since Midway. The Americans knew they were coming. Admiral Charles Lockwood sent Harder to patrol the approaches, to strike where opportunity allowed. For 9 days, Dealey prowled undetected. Then, just before dawn on June 6th, a Japanese patrol plane spotted the faint wake of a periscope 15 miles north of Tawi Tawi. Within minutes, 3 destroyers were bearing down on him, the same 3 now cutting through the moonlight. If you want to see how Commander Dealey fought 3 destroyers at once and lived to change submarine warfare forever, stay with us. Commander Dealey's attack on Ikazuchi shattered years of naval logic. Until that day, submarines had survived by hiding, diving deep and running silent whenever destroyers appeared. A submerged sub was slow, blind, and fragile. A destroyer could race past at nearly 4 times its speed, armed with sonar and depth charges that could crush a hull like a soda can. But Dealey had seen something others missed. Destroyer captains relied on prediction. They expected submarines to flee, so when Harder surged toward Ikazuchi instead of diving away, that expectation killed them. In 5 minutes, a new kind of submarine warfare was born, one that turned aggression into survival. Word of Ikazuchi's destruction flashed across the Pacific. U.S. submariners celebrated the first confirmed destroyer kill in a direct duel. Japan's admirals seethed. Admiral Soimu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, was running out of patience. And destroyers. Between January and May of 1944 alone, Japan had lost 23 of them. These were not just warships. They were the Navy's lifeblood, the shield protecting convoys and carriers, the eyes and ears of every major fleet operation. Without them, Toyota's upcoming masterstroke, Operation Ago, the plan to annihilate America's invasion of the Philippines, was in jeopardy. To regroup and prepare, Toyota gathered his massive mobile fleet in the protected anchorage at Tawi Tawi. There, beneath the watchful eyes of 4 battleships, including the colossal Yamato, 9 aircraft carriers, 15 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, the Japanese Navy waited for its moment. But across the Pacific, American intelligence already knew. Codebreakers had cracked Japan's operational plans. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarines in the Pacific, saw an opportunity. He dispatched Harder to the waters around Tawi Tawi, a single submarine in a sea full of enemies, with simple orders: patrol aggressively and strike any target that presented itself. For over a week, Harder glided unseen beneath the surface, threading through enemy patrols and air sweeps. Then, just before dawn on June 6th, Fate and a Japanese patrol plane found her. 3 destroyers were already on the way, and Commander Dealey, the man who had made submarines charge destroyers, prepared to do it again. 4 days that changed the Pacific. At 3 a.m. on June 6, 1944, a Japanese patrol plane's report sent 3 destroyers racing toward the spot where a faint periscope wake had been seen. The ocean was calm, the sky silvered by a waning moon. Commander Dealey and his crew could hear the sonar pings echoing through the hull, sharp, rhythmic, and closing fast. Through his periscope, Dealey studied the lead ship. Minazuki, 1,250 tons, armed with 4 5-inch guns, zigzagging wildly as she closed in. 2 more destroyers trailed behind, spreading wide to box Harder into a death trap. He turned the submarine's bow directly toward Minazuki. Range, 1,100 yards. Time to impact, 96 seconds. Every man aboard knew the meaning of the order that followed: down the throat. It was the most dangerous maneuver a submarine could attempt, firing torpedoes straight into the bow of an oncoming destroyer, diving beneath her keel and hoping to survive. If the torpedoes missed, the destroyer would drop depth charges at point-blank range. If the dive came too late, the sub would be rammed and crushed. At 750 yards, Dealey gave the command. 3 torpedoes roared from Harder's tubes. "Take her down." 300 feet, the bow pitched steeply as the submarine dove. 40 seconds later, a pair of violent explosions ripped through the water, followed by a third that lifted Harder's stern 6 feet before slamming it back down. When Dealey returned to periscope depth, Minazuki was gone, torn apart, her wreckage scattered across an oil-slicked sea. 2 destroyers in retreat. 1 submarine still hunting. By 9 a.m., Admiral Toyota received the report. Another destroyer lost, this time in home waters. He was livid. 6 more destroyers were ordered into the hunt, but Dealey wasn't done. June 7th, night attack. That night, the skies were heavy and starless, perfect cover. Harder surfaced to recharge her batteries, slicing silently across the dark sea. At 3:12 a.m., the radar operator called out a contact, a single ship 8,000 yards away, moving fast. A destroyer, Hayanami. Her captain, Commander Hideo Kuboki, exhausted after hours of fruitless searching, was heading back to base. Nobody on board expected an American submarine to attack on the surface. Dealey ordered full speed ahead, 21 knots, closing the distance. He wanted to get inside the destroyer's radar range before they could detect him. At 4,000 yards, Hayanami's radar finally picked up a blip. Small, fast, probably another destroyer returning to port, they thought. At 3,000 yards, realization hit. Kuboki shouted for flank speed and turned to ram. Too late. At 2,300 yards, Harder fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck home, detonating near the aft magazine. The explosion tore Hayanami's stern completely off. She rolled hard to starboard and sank within minutes, propellers still spinning as 148 men, including Kuboki, went down with her, 2 destroyers in 24 hours. June 8th, the hunt intensifies. By dawn, Japanese command had had enough. 8 destroyers were pulled from convoy duty and sent to scour the waters around Tawi Tawi. The orders were clear: find and destroy the American submarine at all costs. But Dealey, instead of running, went looking for them. At 2 p.m., Harder's lookout spotted 2 destroyers, Tanakaze and an unidentified escort, zigzagging across Sabutu Passage. Dealey tracked their pattern, calculating their turns like a chess player reading his opponent's next move. Every 8 minutes, the ships altered course. That gave him a 30-second window to fire. He positioned Harder squarely in their path and waited. At 4:30 p.m., Tanakaze turned toward him. Range closed, 3,000 yards, 2,000, 1,500. At 1,200 yards, 4 torpedoes streaked out. The first missed. The next 2 hit near the bridge and forward magazine. The resulting blast was so powerful the crew of Harder heard it through sealed hatches underwater. Tanakaze broke apart, her bow tearing away from the hull before both sections sank in minutes. The escort destroyer charged, dropping depth charges that thundered through the depths. Harder dove to 400 feet and waited. After 40 minutes of relentless pounding, the enemy withdrew, unable to claim victory. 3 destroyers in 3 days. June 9th, the final duel. At dawn, Harder crept to periscope depth 12 miles southwest of Tawi Tawi. Through the lens, Dealey saw 4 destroyers sweeping the waters in formation. Their sonar pings echoed so loudly the sound operator could hear them without headphones. Dealey studied their pattern. The lead destroyer weaved aggressively. The second held a steady course. That one would die first. At 6:12 a.m., the ship turned toward Harder. Range, 4,000 yards. Dealey waited. 3,000, 2,500, 1,800. 3 torpedoes fired. All 3 struck the destroyer's port side within 5 seconds. The explosion sent debris 300 feet into the air. The ship capsized and vanished in under 2 minutes. But the victory came with a price. The other 3 destroyers converged on Harder's position, blanketing the sea with 23 depth charges in 10 minutes. The submarine plunged to 500 feet as lights flickered and pipes burst. For 2 hours they endured the bombardment until silence finally returned. 4 enemy destroyers sunk in 4 days. As Harder limped away, her fuel low and her hull groaning, the Japanese command reeled in disbelief. What one submarine had accomplished in 96 hours would change the course of an entire naval war. The submarine that moved a fleet. By the afternoon of June 9th, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japan's mobile fleet, received an urgent series of reports that seemed impossible. 4 destroyers lost in 4 days, all to the same American submarine. He ran the numbers. If one U.S. boat could slip through the defensive net at Tawi Tawi this easily, the entire anchorage was exposed. His carriers, his fuel ships, his battleships, all vulnerable. Ozawa sent an immediate message to Admiral Toyota. The anchorage is compromised. We must depart at once, but timing mattered. Operation Ago, Japan's counterstrike against the coming American invasion of the Marianas, wasn't supposed to begin until June 15th. Departing early would upend the plan completely. It meant launching without full reconnaissance, scattering destroyer screens still recovering from anti-submarine patrols, and sending supply convoys chasing the fleet instead of leading it. Still, Toyota agreed. Remaining at Tawi Tawi under submarine threat was suicide. At 8 a.m. on June 10, 1944, the Japanese mobile fleet raised anchor. 4 battleships, 9 carriers, 15 cruisers, and 24 destroyers steamed northeast toward the Philippine Sea, 6 days ahead of schedule. American code breakers at Pearl Harbor intercepted the movement within hours. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, immediately adjusted his plans. That single day of extra time gave American carriers the perfect opportunity to position themselves for what would become one of the most decisive naval engagements in history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Meanwhile, Harder continued to stalk the waters off Sibatu Passage. Her fuel was nearly gone and only 5 torpedoes remained. Yet Dealey wasn't done. On the afternoon of June 10th, he encountered 2 more destroyers sweeping north of the passage. At 5:15 p.m., he fired 3 torpedoes at the lead ship. 1 hit near the bow, but failed to sink her. The second destroyer charged immediately. Dealey fired his last 2 torpedoes. Both missed. Now he was defenseless. He ordered an emergency dive as depth charges began to rain down. The submarine plunged past 500 feet, the hull creaking, the crew gripping whatever they could as explosions rattled the steel walls. For an hour and a half, the destroyer made pass after pass, 42 depth charges in total. When the attack finally stopped, silence returned to the control room. Harder had survived. Barely. She surfaced after nightfall and began the long journey back to Fremantle, Australia. 17 days later, she arrived battered but unbeaten. 5 destroyers attacked, 4 confirmed sunk, 1 damaged. It was the most successful anti-destroyer patrol in submarine history. When Admiral Lockwood met Dealey at the pier, he didn't wait for ceremony. He pinned a Navy cross on his chest and asked the question every submarine commander dreaded and secretly longed to hear, "Can you do it again?" Dealey's answer was instant. "Give me torpedoes, and I'll sink 10. In July 1944, Harder sat in dry dock at Fremantle, battered from her legendary 5th Patrol. Her hull was patched, her systems rebuilt, and her crew replenished. Dealey drilled his new men relentlessly, teaching the same down-the-throat tactics that had made him a legend. By late July, every U.S. submarine commander in the Pacific had studied Harder's patrol reports. Dealey's aggressive method, charging rather than retreating, was reshaping the entire doctrine of undersea warfare. On August 5th, Harder sailed again, this time as leader of a 3-submarine wolf pack alongside USS Harder and USS Harder. Their mission, patrol the western waters of Luzon and strike Japanese convoys supplying the Philippines. The patrol began flawlessly. On August 21st, the trio ambushed a 16-ship convoy off Palawan Bay, sinking 4 cargo vessels totaling over 22,000 tons. The next day, Harder and Harder attacked 3 coastal defense ships near Bataan. All 3 went down. By August 23rd, Harder had spent her torpedoes and headed home. Harder and Harder stayed behind, lurking off Dasol Bay. But the Japanese had been listening. They had intercepted radio traffic between the submarines during the convoy attack, and they sent something special to hunt them down. August 24th. The trap closes. At 4:53 a.m., USS Harder was submerged 4 miles off Hermana Mayer Island. Through her periscope, her captain could see Harder on the surface, roughly 4,500 yards to the south, both submarines preparing to attack a damaged Japanese destroyer from the previous day's battle. Then Harder's sonar operator froze. A new sound echoed through the water, echo ranging, close, getting closer. 2 Japanese escort vessels, CD-22 and PB-102, were moving fast, sweeping the area at 18 knots. They'd been hunting American subs for days, and now they had a perfect contact. At 5:20 a.m., Harder tried to warn Harder by radio. Silence. Either Harder's transmitter was off, or she was already diving. 5 minutes later, Dealey spotted the escorts and crash-dived. Diesel engines still running as she submerged, Harder left a bubbling wake that betrayed her position. CD-22's sonar operator locked on. Range 1,200 yards. Depth roughly 200 feet. Still descending. The escort's captain ordered an immediate depth charge attack. At 5:47 a.m., the first pattern fell. Explosions bracketed Harder with deadly precision. 3 detonated within 50 feet of the hull. The aft compartments cracked open under pressure. Seawater surged in, flooding the stern in under 2 minutes. The submarine's bow lurched upward as the weight of the flooding dragged her down. Dealey ordered the ballast blown. "Emergency surface!" But it was hopeless. The air systems fought against the torrent of water, but Harder was too heavy, too deep. A second attack came minutes later. At 5:52 a.m., another string of depth charges detonated almost on top of her. The hull buckled. Lights flickered, then died. Bulkheads collapsed like tin cans. Within seconds, the submarine imploded under the immense pressure. At 6 a.m., CD-22 and PB-102 reported a successful kill. Oil and wreckage floated to the surface. No survivors. All 79 men aboard Harder were gone, including Commander Samuel Dealey and radioman Calvin Bull, who had helped sink 5 destroyers in June.
USS Harder remained submerged until nightfall. Her captain sent a brief, grim message: Harder lost. When Admiral Lockwood received it the next morning, he ordered every submarine in the area to withdraw. The waters off Dasol Bay were now a grave. Weeks later, in early September 1944, the U.S. Navy declared Harder presumed lost with all hands. No public details were released. Submarine operations were still secret. The American public wouldn't learn what Harder had done or how she'd been lost until after the war. On the other side of the Pacific, Admiral Toyota received the news with satisfaction. The submarine that had humiliated his fleet was finally gone. But what he didn't realize was that her legacy was already shaping the future, and her 4 days in June had rewritten the war before she ever went down. The submarine that changed the war. 9 days after Harder's final battle, On June 19, 1944, the fleets she had set in motion clashed in the open Pacific. It became the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier engagement in naval history. 15 American carriers faced 9 from Japan, nearly 900 U.S. aircraft against 430 Japanese. For 2 days, the sky burned. By the end, Japan's carrier air force was annihilated. 376 planes shot down, 3 carriers sunk, Taiho, Shokaku, Hio, and 2 battleships crippled. American losses, 30 aircraft. Pilots would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But what history often forgets is how close that battle came to being very different. Had Admiral Ozawa departed on schedule, June 15th, his fleet would have arrived with full reconnaissance, coordinated air cover, and complete supply lines. Instead, Harder's sudden rampage forced him to flee 6 days early, scattering his ships across 200 miles of ocean. His search planes burned precious fuel trying to find the Americans. His destroyers were still limping home from anti-submarine duty. His supply ships lagged days behind. So when the U.S. carriers found him, Ozawa's fleet was disorganized, his pilots unprepared, and his defenses thin. The battle that crippled Japan's naval air power, that ensured victory in the Pacific, happened as it did because of a single submarine commander who sank 4 destroyers in 4 days. Admiral Lockwood understood this immediately. In his post-war memoir, he called Harder's 5th Patrol the most strategically important submarine operation of the entire Pacific War. Between 1941 and 1944, U.S. submarines had already destroyed over 1,000 Japanese ships, mostly freighters and transports, but few dared engage warships. They were too fast, too heavily armed, too deadly. Dealey shattered that belief. His down-the-throat attack tactic, charging head-on at destroyers instead of fleeing, defied logic, but worked precisely because it was unpredictable. Japanese captains hesitated for only seconds when they saw a submarine advancing rather than diving. Those few seconds were fatal. By war's end, American submarines inspired by Dealey's methods had sunk 214 Japanese warships, including 4 carriers, 1 battleship, 9 cruisers, and 38 destroyers. Japan had started the war with 63 destroyers and built 49 more. 38 were lost to U.S. submarines. Harder alone accounted for 4 in 1 week. In March 1946, President Harry Truman stood on the White House lawn beside Edwina Dealey, presenting her late husband's Medal of Honor. The citation read, "This remarkable record of 5 vital Japanese destroyers sunk in 5 short-range torpedo attacks attests to the valiant fighting spirit of Commander Dealey and his indomitable command." The Navy later named a destroyer escort after him, USS Dealey, DE-1006, commissioned in 1954 and in service until 1972. Harder herself received the Presidential Unit Citation and 6 battle stars for her patrols. Her motto, "Hit 'em harder," became legendary across the submarine fleet, a simple phrase that captured everything her crew had done. But Harder's true legacy wasn't in medals or citations. It was in the tactical revolution she unleashed. Before Dealey, submarine doctrine was built on stealth and evasion, a game of patience and silence. If a destroyer found you, you ran deep and prayed. Dealey flipped that doctrine on its head. He understood that courage, timing, and surprise could turn weakness into a weapon. When a destroyer expected fear and found aggression instead, it hesitated, and that hesitation was fatal. His approach redefined submarine warfare, proving that sometimes the best defense isn't to hide, but to strike first and harder. 80 years later, the ocean remembered. Nearly 8 decades after her final dive, the sea gave up one of its secrets. On May 22, 2024, an underwater expedition led by explorer Tim Taylor and the Lost 52 Project located the wreck of USS Harder in the South China Sea. She rests upright in the silt, more than 3,700 feet below the surface, about 12 miles west of Dasol Bay, the same waters where she vanished in August 1944. Her hull is remarkably intact, except for the scars left by the depth charges that destroyed her. The shattered steel near the conning tower still bears witness to those final moments of battle. The U.S. Navy has designated Harder a protected war grave. No salvaging, no recovery, only remembrance. But the discovery meant more than the finding of a wreck. It meant families, after 80 silent years, finally knew where their fathers, sons, and brothers had come to rest. It meant closure, and a reminder that courage doesn't fade beneath the waves. At the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, instructors still teach Dealey's down-the-throat attack as a case study in decisive warfare. Modern submarines don't need to charge destroyers anymore. Their wire-guided torpedoes can track targets from miles away, yet the principle remains timeless. When your enemy expects you to retreat, advancing can change everything. The Naval History and Heritage Command preserves Harder's original patrol reports. Every torpedo solution, every depth charge run, every terse radio transmission. Together they form a portrait of a commander who never stopped adapting, who studied every mistake, and who led by quiet, fearless example. Commander Samuel Dealey now rests at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 59, grave 874. His headstone bears only a few words: Medal of Honor, Destroyer Killer. Every year on August 24th, the anniversary of Harder's sinking, families of the 79 men who served aboard gather to lay flowers and tell stories. Many of those men were barely older than 20, farm hands from Iowa, machinists from Michigan, college graduates from California. They knew the odds. Submarine duty had the highest casualty rate of any U.S. service in World War II. 22% never came home, and still they volunteered. Radio man Calvin Bull, who helped sink 5 destroyers, was 24 when he died. John Mao, who survived earlier patrols and later rose to admiral, spent his life telling their story before passing away in 2010. The last surviving crewman, Paul Bryce, died in 2022 at the age of 98. With his passing, no one remained to speak firsthand for the men of Harder. That is why stories like this matter. Documents can tell us what happened, torpedo angles, tonnage sunk, medals earned, but they cannot capture what it felt like to charge straight at a destroyer, to hear depth charges hammering above, or to watch your captain make life-or-death calls in seconds. The record says Harder sank 4 destroyers in 4 days. What it cannot say is how courage sounds when spoken through steel and silence. If this story moved you, if it reminded you what ordinary men achieved in impossible circumstances, help keep their memory alive. Like, share, subscribe. Not for numbers, but for remembrance. Every click carries their names a little further, because the 79 men of USS Harder did not vanish into the sea. They became part of history itself, proof that sometimes one submarine can change the course of a war.